I was born as Zygmunt, little Zygmunt, which is the diminutive of Sigmund Rolat, Rosenblatt, Sigmund Rosenblatt, Częstochowa. It's easily the most Catholic city, not just in Poland,
Yes.
but really, certainly in all of Europe. You see, Poland remains a very, very Catholic country. If you're in any church in France, in Italy even, churches are almost empty except if there is a wedding or a funeral. In Poland, churches are still full. And Czestochowa has this relic of Black Madonna on Jasna Góra, and some 3-4 million pilgrims every year visit Częstochowa. My mother's name was Mania, my father's name was Henry Chaim, my grandfather's name was Abraham, my brother's name was Jerzek. My brother was 6 years older than I. He was born in 1924.
In 1930 and 31 and 32, and when you begin to be aware, when you begin to have memories, Sigmund, of your childhood living with your brother and your parents, was it a good life?
Yes, I had a very happy childhood in Czestochowa, in Poland, and we were very Jewish. We also were proud Polish citizens. My father served in the Polish army. The language, which my first language, and actually my native and only language until I found myself in the camp, in the munitions factory, was Polish.
You did not speak Yiddish?
They called me at first in the camp the kleine Goy, you know, but I very quickly learned Yiddish.
At the same time, you said you did have a Jewish home. Your home had a
Yes, and I attended from the first grade what we called the Hebrew Gymnasium, which was the best school. There were 6 grades of elementary school, 4 classes of gymnasium, followed by 2 classes of so-called lyceum. And from the first grade, we learned Hebrew. Not Yiddish, but Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. What was the tone of your parents?
I had very loving parents. My father was, to me, very, very special. We used to, every weekend, my father used to go to a barber shop, and he would be shaved, and on the wall there hung the posters of the movies being shown in the city, and there were 5 theaters, movie theaters in Częstochowa, and together we would decide on which movie we would see that afternoon. My favorite actor at that time was Errol Flynn. I remember the Robin Hood, Charge of the Light Brigade, and so on.
It sounds like a lovely childhood.
Lovely childhood. My father also used to take me with him on business trips. He sometimes had to go to Katowice, to Warsaw. He used to take me in Będzin, a very Jewish city, not very far from Częstochowa. We used to go on a bus. There were ruins of a big castle there and so on. So yes, I had a very, very warm. I have here, maybe we can have that picture. That's the only picture of my family I have. So you can imagine that this is my heirloom and my most prized possession. And here you have my father, my mother, to the left. And this is my aunt with her little boy. And here am I. As you can see, my father holds me because I wanted to get off this droshka. And I have a very, very sour expression because I wanted to sit here.
With your brother?
Where my brother is sitting next to the
driver.
to the Fuhrmann, what they call it, to the driver. You see, he is all happy and laughing.
Yes, he is.
And I'm
You're
very,
not happy.
very
No.
angry.
So what's the first moment that the darkness of the Holocaust begins to come into your life?
September 1st is usually the first day of school. September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and Czestochowa had the dubious pleasure of being the first major city overrun by the Germans because we were near the German border. On September 1st, we were not in Częstochowa, we were actually in Kaminsk, which was a summer resort, and we were about to go back to Czestochowa. If I remember correctly, it was a weekend. So since Czestochowa was just about to be overrun, my two uncles who were with us at that time rented a big villa, and they were with us, and they decided we're not going to go back to Częstochowa. They've bought a horse and a furmanka. I don't know even how to call a furmanka in English. It's a horse carriage, actually. And we started running away from the invading German army. It was very interesting because this is how I found out at a very early age what it was like to have something to do with peasants, perhaps ignorant peasants, how we had to bribe them, buy from them the place for the day when we were sleeping, when they were feeding us, and then at night we were actually carrying on, running away westward. And that, during the day, we considered that it was safer to be in a hut of a peasant. And, but of course, we were not the only ones running away. There were hundreds, thousands of others. And that went on for about 8 days.
Really?
By that time, the Germans overran already, well, most of Poland. Warsaw was actually the only city which was holding out. They held out for almost 30 days. And of course, from the east, the Russians advanced, and they occupied 1/3 of eastern Poland. So on the 8th or 9th day, we started moving back. Now, at that point, the Germans couldn't tell a Jew from a Christian, so our, other than the question of inconvenience riding in a small horse cart, not just my mother and my brother and I, but also the two other families of my two uncles. While it took us 8 days to get almost as far as Kielce, the return trip only took 3 or 4 days. Czestochowa at that time was already occupied by Germans, but everybody went back at that point to their apartment. The ghetto, the big ghetto, was only started sometime later that year, 1939, around November, I think. And the first Jewish building to be occupied, not to be occupied, to be destroyed actually, was our beautiful Nai Shul, as it was called, the new synagogue.
in the first 9 years of your life, did you deal with anti-Semitism as a child?
I will tell you about me personally, but remember, you know, our family, myself, is not an island. So even if I personally was not exposed to, this person was not exposed very much to anti-Semitism, I did witness anti-Semitism. We, for example, in our household, one of our saints, if a Jew can have a saint, was our great Marshal Joseph Pilsudski. Joseph Pilsudski was in effect, the dictator of Poland, but a very benevolent dictator. He was the chief military leader who actually, and his legions, liberated Poland. Then with the help of Paderewski, that great pianist, who ensconced himself in Versailles after World War I, with the help of President Wilson, really brought Poland independence. Poland became an independent country again during the Versailles Conference after 1918. 1920, Poland became an independent country. Marshal Joseph Pilsudski had numerous Jews in his legions, and he was a very, very liberal man, and he fought against those who had anti-Semitic feelings. He died on May 12, 1935. There was a great mourning in my home, and we observed that mourning every year, year after year, during the anniversary of his death. But we were not the only ones. I would say by far the great majority of Jewish people felt the same way as we did. Now, remember also that after 1935, there was a growing wave of fascism in Europe, especially in Germany, neighboring Germany. Then there was also Italy. In France, while you may have had a French Prime Minister, Léon Blum, there was also a very, very sizable right-wing element, very right-wing, extreme right-wing. And so I remember as a child groups of what they called Endeka. Endeka was the anti-Semitic movement, which would march through the streets, yelling and singing songs. For example, there was the finest shoe store. We lived at Alea, at this boulevard number 6, and this store was number 10, so it was really 2 buildings down. I remember a group of people there congregating in front, and in Polish, well, it won't mean much to you if I tell you, but they were singing a ditty, nie kupuj u Żyda, to najlepsza porada, kto kupuje u Żyda, sam siebie okrada. And that they were singing it. Don't buy from a Jew, that is the best advice. Whoever buys from a Jew steals from himself. Very, very rough translation, but you get the message. Now, so you had, well, if I will only add, for example, that at the universities, for the first time, they started quotas for Jews, because Jews, who are 10% of the population, as a rule, occupied more than 10% of the chairs in the university. So sometimes when there was a very strong sermon at Easter, you would have big groups of people going through the through the boulevards and streets, and a few windows were broken. But then, if they went a little too far, where there was the completely Jewish sections, then some of them, got beaten up, you see. So, and even when we talk about pogroms, because sometimes, let's say, when some of these windows were broken, these were called pogroms, but these were not the Ukrainian or the Russian pogroms. And I personally, before the war, was not really, I didn't have any unpleasantness. I don't remember any unpleasantness. Once I remember when I was going to school, to this Hebrew gymnasium, a couple of kids, 2, 3, threw stones at me. And I remember I told my parents about it, and then they decided that my brother, who attended the same school, but 6 years higher, he was walking with me. And this was, in a way, like for protection. I remember also that most of my days when I was a little boy were in the company of a Polish nanny who was to me like a mother. And actually, she lost her life because she loved me so much.
How?
When the ghetto, the big ghetto, was started, she did not want to leave me. And so she lived with us, and the last day before the big ghetto was liquidated, and this was the big ghetto, the first, the liquidation proceeded in 6 selections. Our area was to be the first, the Aleas. And my mother begged her to leave the ghetto. At that time, Gentiles and so on, without any problem, could have left. They arranged already for me to be hidden. And when we left the day before, she promised my mother that she's going to leave. But, she didn't have any higher education. Her everything was me. She was convinced that I'm going to come back. And it's only later we found out that she was just swept away.
What was her
with
name?
everybody else, Elka.
Elka.
At that point, there were almost 50,000 Jews in Częstochowa because there were at least 10,000 brought in from the surviving small townships. And when the so-called action, the selection started, and as I think I mentioned to you that the first one was on Yom Kippur, and then there were 6 cattle trains which left the freight station. By the way, I would say one of the most horrible specimens which are shown in our exhibition, the last place at Hebrew Union College, actually, in Cincinnati. You mentioned the place. But when it was shown in Houston, we had President Bush in attendance at the opening. And he actually broke down when he saw what I will now tell you about. You see, we managed to get from the German railways, the Germans were very methodical, and everything had to run planmäßig and to the minute. And so you see a table of these trains. And you can see there the 6 trains, starting with the first on September 22nd, 1942. And you see to the minute when the train left the freight station. You then see where it stopped. Remember, these were steam trains. You had to take on coal and water. So where they stopped in Piotrków, in Koluszki, Skierniewice, in 5 different places on the way to Treblinka. And then in Treblinka, the train stayed for exactly 4 hours and 20 minutes. And then Rückkehr des Leerzuges, the return trip, Leerzuges, empty train, the return trip of the empty train. Again, stopping at each place, again documented to the minute. And then Ankunft, Fracht station in Czestochowa, repeating it 6 times. When I explained all that to President Bush, and right next to it, there is a sculpture, Willenberg, Peretz Willenberg's son. Peretz Willenberg was his father, a painter. I showed you those beautiful frescoes which he painted at our synagogue. And his son became a sculptor in his later years in Israel. And among those sculptures, there is one where a father helps his little boy to take off his shoes before he unlaces the shoes before entering the gas chamber. And when he saw, this timetable, and then, yes. Now, Willenberg is now, today, he is the last living survivor of the Treblinka uprising. One of the things that I fight most in Poland, but in other places too, was this myth, that this libelous myth, that Jews fought that the Jews died like sheep, like sheep, and that is libelous. That is the most horrible lie, and I really am a living proof that this is so, because in my small family, you mentioned before, my mother, my father, Jerzy, I am the sole survivor, but my father died in the Treblinka uprising. You see, when the trains stopped in Treblinka, that Yom Kippur, they needed a few more people. Periodically, they used to kill those Jews, they called them Sonderkommandos, who worked in the places like Treblinka, Auschwitz. And they asked, Willenberg was young, fit, they let him live, and they also called out who was an accountant. Now, my father knew math very well, and he raised his hand. My father was writing up all that gruesome, the gold from teeth and all the other things which made their way to Berlin, some of it to Switzerland, and they didn't have any arms. They rose with their bare arms, and 99 out of 100 died. Willenberg was one of literally among very few who did survive. My father died. Jerzy, my brother, was the youngest. He was 18 in a group of 6. The oldest was 24. They, with the help of my uncle, they received arms and they left the Czestochowa ghetto and they fought to the extent that they derailed a train once. They needed a German uniform for something that they were preparing, and they killed a German soldier in the park in Czestochowa. And they were caught. During the winter, they came back to Częstochowa with the plans of carrying on around March, when it would be warmer already. They lived in an apartment there, knowing that in that same building there was a hiding place, children's hiding place. I actually, after hiding out in an attic for about 7-8 weeks during those actions, before being smuggled into the small ghetto, so-called, because when I say small ghetto, there were 50,000 Jews when they started taking people to Treblinka. They selected about 6,000 to 7,000 people for work. There were an additional 2,000 to 3,000 people who, like myself, survived by being hidden, and we had to be then smuggled in. And that Wilson Street 34, that empty building, was more or less like a transit place. And so in the same building, not only these 6 lived, but also very near them in that same building, there was a hiding place for the kids. And one day, actually he was my classmate, Kongretsky, Adaś is the diminutive of Adam, left the hiding place, not to be smuggled into the ghetto, but they found for him a hiding place with a Christian family. And so he was actually stopped on the street, and his behavior, maybe he started crying, whatever, we don't know exactly, but he was taken to the Gestapo building at Kiliński Street. And as we found out soon after that, to save himself, he told them not only about the children's hiding place, where he came from, but what he thought would save his life probably, that there are Jewish men with arms. And 2-3 hours later, the building was surrounded. And you see, my brother, and the other 5, they didn't know all of that, you see. But it was very uncharacteristic of them to surrender. They surrendered because they thought that by doing that they will be taken away and the children would live. Well, the children, of course, they were taken to be interrogated. And we know exactly what happened there. The children were killed right there on the spot. And This is not the end of the story, you see, because they were taken to jail. They were tortured the whole night, and I found out about that, and I'll tell you in a minute how. But everybody knew that. I remember my mother and I couldn't sleep in our apartment because everybody told us you have to get away from your little apartment that was already in the small ghetto, because they will not be able to survive such interrogations. But not one of them told the Germans where they got the arms or even their real names. The next morning, they were taken to the Jewish cemetery and they were shot. But what I'll tell you now, which I actually don't talk about very much, you see about, well, I started by telling you that I took my daughters, because before the bar mitzvah I wanted them to see where I come from. It was as if it would be, you could call it my private march of the living. I did the same with my son when he had his bar mitzvah. And that grave was in horrible shape. We couldn't actually find what used to be that plate with the names and so on. And little Amanda, we were already about to leave. It was already becoming dark. And she saw this part of what looked like a stone with names, and she crawled underneath, and she saw actually, she called out J-E-R-Z. She found that, you know. And my daughters, of course, Samantha especially, cried about how terrible this cemetery looks and so on. And I promised them that I'm going to take these 6 boys, obviously we couldn't take only my brother, to a proper grave in Israel. And that's not that easy. This was shortly, a few years actually, after the Munich sportsmen were killed. We did manage actually to get a place for them right near that grave. Mm-hmm. Then we had problem with the Polish authorities. That's a story. But in any case, I finally did get the permission. And I'll never forget how we're going to open the grave, to move them. You know, we had to arrange for the transfer in sealed boxes, you know, from Poland. Wasn't easy because at that time there was no direct flight from Poland to Israel and so on. And I got a doctor, a coroner, you know, who would identify. We wanted to make sure, you see. And so I have to tell you now that about a month earlier, I attended a wedding of a pair who from Long Island, and their father survived the war as a Christian, and it so happened that he was in jail that night on some minor transgression, I don't know. And he was in the jail, and many, many times he wanted to see me. I was a very busy businessman, and his reputation wasn't the best. And I really was postponing from month to month and so on. Now, knowing that, anyway, they landed at the family table, more or less. They were distant cousins of mine. And I was sitting next to him. And he told me about what happened that night. And you can imagine how, first of all, I felt terrible that I never really wanted to see him previously. And then he says, you know, and just as the truck with the six was about to leave the jail, somebody from the jail, one of the Germans, called out, wait, wait, we have one more person. And they brought up Kongretsky, that little boy. Now, why do I tell you about it? Because when they opened the grave, they, this coroner from I wanted to make sure that these were 6 boys. And there was, I remember, a table with a black tablecloth and some his instruments, and he takes out the skull, visibly with a bullet having gone through it. And he says, 22, 23 years old. And then he takes the next one, and he says, similar, maybe slightly younger, 20. And then the next one, and he says, 11, 12 years old. And I said, my God, this is not the proper grave. You have to immediately, very, very neatly put back exactly, because you cannot disturb this grave. This is not my brother's grave. And so they covered the grave. Now, of course, this actually proved that this was the grave when I heard from this man that little Adaś Kongretsky was also killed with my brother.
Did you go back?
No.
So your brother is still at that same cemetery?
With Adaś Kongretsky, yes.
Sigmund, when people hear this kind of story, and they grew up in America, it's more than a generation away. We have never experienced anything like what you had to go through. And I want to understand what happens to a person, what happened to you. Were you frightened the entire time?
Well, when we were hidden, and I was hidden during the selection, I was hidden also later. Remember, I was still at that time, already after the selection, I was still only 12 years old. I was little. I didn't start growing up really until I was 15, 16. And so every time that the Germans and the Ukrainians entered the small ghetto, because somebody denounced, let's say, one hiding place or the other. See, my mother was going in the morning. She was leaving the small ghetto. She was going to work and then coming back at night. Until that point, until that time, I had to be hidden. And we were hidden. We lived actually at 2, 3 different places there. But each one of these places had what we called bunker, bunkers, you know. Some of them in the cellar, some of them in the attic. One of them was in an apartment where you used to enter a big credenza, chest of drawers, and there was the back of it moved to the side, and that's where you were. But of course, you, in every case, you couldn't get out by yourself. You actually had to be liberated from these places when my mother, when these grown-ups came back. One place, for example, this building was one of the few 3-story buildings where we lived most of the time. And There was a place downstairs in the cellar, and there was also one in the attic. I hated that place downstairs because down there, you see, we used to go into the place, and then those our parents or some men would throw coal behind us there, so that nobody would think, that there is a hiding place further down. Of course, in every case, we relied on those people also to take us out of there. I hate to think what would happen, but there was also a place up in the attic, and I actually preferred that place, if only because it was more roomy, and it actually had a little window from which you could see what was happening outside, a hole really. And the place downstairs, incidentally, after we moved out already of that building, was actually during one of the selections was discovered. And I hated this place mainly because they had a little baby in there, and that baby would cry sometimes. So the mother tried as much as possible to stifle these cries. But I don't know whether this is how it was finally discovered and so on, but it was discovered. And of course, in a case like that, everybody was shot on the spot. So your question was?
Did you live in fear all the time?
There were a few other children, and we played. Were we afraid? We're used to being afraid. I was in that one hiding place where we survived those selections, the liquidation of the so-called big ghetto. We were there for 6-7 weeks. After the first week, life goes on. We played. So we were together until one final selection, which took place in Hasag, in the munitions factory, during which my mother was taken away.
Why weren't you taken?
Well, there were about 3,000, almost 3,000 kids and older people smuggled into the small ghetto who survived in hiding places. So there must have been probably at least a few hundred children when that small ghetto was liquidated. And there was an area, this Rineček, where everybody was brought out. Treblinka was no more at that point. So everybody who was not judged fit to work at that point was taken to the cemetery and their mass executions. And my sheer luck was that I was at the very end of the group of children, well, quite a crowd of children, who were being taken gradually away in trucks. And as we were about to enter the truck, the director of the munitions factory, his name was Lit, he came to this Rineček to take away all the workers to his place, to the munitions factory. He saw us, and it was quite graphic what was happening or was about to happen. He came over to our group. There were 34 of us. And he said, "Ich nehme diese Kinder." I'm taking these children. And it wasn't that easy, This Degenhardt, the Captain Degenhardt, there was another one there, they called him Weißer Kopp, was his pseudonym, Klipsch, and who liked to, he liked to have his fun with attractive Jewish women, shooting them. And anyway, they opposed it. What will you do? How children, what will you do with them? The children don't belong in it. I will find work for them. And he took us with him. And actually during that first selection, the same actors there, the same Degenhardt and the same Klipsch and the others, they were about to take us away, right? And again, lit quite loudly, said no, Jugendliches Capo, we were called. Jugendliches Capo bleibt, remains here.
He was a real hero. He was a real hero.
Yes, I was actually asked a number of times after the war what happened to him. And well, I feel guilty that I didn't do something about it, and maybe all the people should do something about it. But my excuse is only, well, I was only 14 when I was liberated, and I was a little boy, really. But we should have done something about who knows, maybe in the retreat and so on he was killed. I don't know.
Did you ever become overwhelmingly angry? I'm fascinated by who you are, because I don't sense anger in you. I sense that somehow you're at peace inside. I could be wrong, but that's my sense of you. And that you feel you're doing good.
You are right. I have not. And in this case, remember, I am really, it's a very funny thing to say, but while I always repeat when they ask me, well, how did you survive? And I said, well, first and second and third, I was lucky. But in my case, there is one anomaly almost, because I live because of two Germans. I not only live because of two Germans, I am who I am because of two Germans. The first one was this director Litt. The second one was a retired University of Munich professor, Eugen Zipp, who was ready to prepare me for what they used to call in German Reifeprüfung, and in Poland Matura, and that's actually what we would call here Regents examination. So from the time that I arrived in Munich, from the time that he started educating me, there were actually not quite 18 months, okay? Now this man, 6 days a week, spent 6 hours a day with me, and we did it. I mean, I passed this was one reason why when I arrived in Cincinnati, and the Jewish Family Service Bureau were wonderful, I was one of the very few who had a choice, because the Family Service Bureaus wanted to have a young Jewish boy whom they could educate and so on. So I could have gone to the University of Chicago, I could have gone in St. Louis there was a very good university there, I could have gone to Minneapolis and to Cincinnati, and I went to all four, and it was my choice. And so Cincinnati really took me in. I was very lucky, but it was all because this wonderful man, Eugen Zipp, made it possible for me. So when I arrived here, my only obstacle really was that I didn't know English. You mentioned, I think, that there is not that much anger within me. No, there is not really anger within me. Quite the contrary. I prize, I'm quite aware how horrible some people were during the war. I've seen horrible things. I've seen executions. I've also seen people after the war who saved Jews at the risk of their life. I know a family in Częstochowa whose father and mother were killed because they were hiding Jews. So, you know, you balance it. You can, to the end of your life, hate the bad ones. I don't, okay? It's not that I don't hate them, I do hate them, but hatred is not the predominant feeling in my life. I'd rather, personally, honor those who, at the risk of their life, save Jews. And remember, Poland today is really, when compared with the other countries in Europe, it's a haven. I mean, you have here the wonderful Isaac Bashevis singer in Warsaw. You have here the 24th Festival of Jewish Culture in Krakow. And the most important, I would say, few words in this invitation you see is here. 2 stages from our window. Now, what are the 2 stages? The first stage is this huge stage, and this, by the way, lasts from about 6 p.m. to about 2 a.m. Repeated are all the best singing acts, klezmers, dancing from the previous 7-8 days. Here you have some 15,000-20,000 young people, right? And if you would see here these youngsters, how they sing, dance, participate, enjoy themselves for 7-8 hours. Now, 98% of them are all Catholic Poles. You know, that's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
And this is repeated in Warsaw, in Wrocław, in Kazimierz. And you know, now try to think, try to compare this kind of a concert today in Paris, in Brussels, anywhere in Europe today, right? If you would have a concert of 20,000 young Jewish people in Paris, you would need a battalion of police, right? Now, I don't know if any of you have been to one of these festivals, but if you were, I don't think you've seen many policemen, and I don't think you've seen any people who didn't feel completely safe. Completely safe. So that should be, I think, that matters. Mm-hmm. You know, this exhibition, Jews of Częstochowa, this was not my idea. You know, I like to meet with young people whenever I started coming back to Poland. And they ask, well, you know, there are so few Jewish students here. And we wonder, how was it, you know, after all, if 1/3 of the city of Czestochowa was Jewish, and today there are so few of them, where did they live? What did they do? Were the Jewish schools? After all, they were neighbors of our grandparents, in some cases our parents. Tell us about it. Well, Ms. Galski decided to teach a course, and they reserved a classroom of about 35 chairs for 35 students. And they had over 10 times as many, over 300 applications, and they actually taught in the they call it aula, in the big hall and so on. Well, look at the museum. That is the main thing, you know, because that will show, you see, we've lived in Poland for over 1,000 years in bigger numbers since the destruction of the temple in Israel than anywhere else in the world. And we can be proud of what we Polish Jews have accomplished. I mean, Israel, after all, was born in Poland. The Halutzim, already since the 19th century, there was all a Polish movement.
Yes.
Hollywood was born in Poland. How many of the Nobel Prize winners, their parents or grandparents came from Poland? So I think that people should know about it. Look, I'll show you a little trick, which I usually, you see. This is a Polish 10 zloty bill, right? It's around $3. And here you have the first Polish king, Mieszko I, right? That's around 960 AD, right? Now, on this side, you have the first Polish coin, the talar. And here you have Hebrew lettering, because the minters at that time were Jewish. That shows you how long, how fruitful is our history.
Yasha koach to you. You're fabulous.
Well, thank you.
And I thank you so much. You should go from strength to strength.
Thank you.
Kol tuva hatzlacha, you continue to do successful, wonderful, good things for yourself and your family and for the Jewish people and for the connection that you have started. And you explained it so beautifully and you've opened up windows and doors. You are really making, you know, I want everybody in their own way to make their contribution. You've made a very special contribution. And you're a very lovely, wonderful man. And it's so lovely of you to let me come and see you. And I thank you very, very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.